Micah Sky, thank you very much for what you are contributing through the art and science of living foods. I'm proud to be the publisher of this book. It's not just a cookbook, though. It's a 5-book series that's going to detail to an extremely scientific level what foods are doing in our bodies so that we can be our own doctors, so that we can use this guide as a way to live a life of mental acuity and more energy. And above all, over the 17 years that you wrote the book, my understanding is that you have come across a lot of bad practices in the vegan diet. So tell me a little bit real quickly about what happened 17 years ago when you started down this journey that is now the Living Foods Cookbook, The Art and Science of Living Foods, that we just published actually yesterday.
We did. And I'm so grateful for you and all the hard work you put into it. And yeah, this collective now movement to bring more awareness to the science of food and biochemical nutrition, and that there can still be artistry and a culinary uh beauty that you can create with food, because we tend to see, if I have a healthier diet, then somehow that's compromised in flavor, in the quality or culinary enjoyment of something. I'm losing things the more I purify a diet. And I feel like all of the world has kind of, in a good way, gotten more into foods. If you think about the 80s and 90s, I feel like food quality was just so generic and marginalized.
Right.
And with
Steaks,
like these
potatoes,
TV shows that, what?
steaks, potatoes, and shrimp cocktail if you're fancy. Who's it?
And even just restaurants had a very manufactured way that they made everything, and everything got very, commercialized and institutionalized through food as we transitioned 70s, 80s, 90s. And then you started to see through, ironically, television and networks like the Food Network started to put the focus on good quality food again, and cooking shows, and getting to see chefs like Gordon Ramsay and different chefs like that doing these higher quality things. And I watched people become more food oriented and interested in better quality food. And I feel like it actually set the bar for restaurants to have to step it up to some
Yeah.
degree. And you saw a lot better restaurants coming out, and people wanting that kind of more culinary. The culinary artistry started to return back to at least to the restaurant industry.
Yeah.
And also people started to get more inspired to make their own yummy foods at home, because you had a lot of shows showing you how to make foods yourself. And I watched that. That was kind of an exciting period that for me as a chef who always loved creating the art of food, which I think when you just learn how to incorporate and you learn the culinary arts, you see the art of food and you become an artist, whether you're aware of it or not, and you enjoy the process of preparing and making food. And obviously as a parent, and I got 4 food critics that are way tougher than any of the food critics I've had as a chef. So if I can, make food delicious that my kids will eat, that's actually good for them, it's like that's a huge success point. So, but along my journey, I went into, mainly through spiritual practices, the desire to purify my diet, become vegan. Then eventually I got into living foods, because one of my colleagues and fellow students who trained with one of my yogic practitioner teachers, who, by the way, was very adamant to identify all of the spiritual gurus and all these people and how they don't incorporate food into the practice. And that was the thing that he was innovating differently, was that your food is part of your practices. So you're going to do all this breath work and open your body and heal your body with these different techniques and oxygenate your cells with breath work. And then you're going to go eat some garbage food, or you're going to go
Yeah.
eat some overcooked vegetarian Indian food with tons of oils in it and all this garbage. And he was like, the food was part of the practice. So after we would do 2 hours of breath work and stretching,
Mhm.
we would transition right into the kitchen, and he would then make us food, and the
Wow.
food would be part of the practice. The class kept going. And so that brought, and he was also a biochemical nutritionist, so
Really?
that brought a really beautiful foundation for me then going into living foods, where I happen to be around some really innovative living food chefs in LA. And LA had, a very big centralized foundation of these chefs writing very successful books for the raw food movement as it was starting to come forward. And so for me as a chef, I then was coming in from, training in as a gourmet chef in, 4 and 5 star kitchens, trained originally in American bistro and Pacific Northwest and French cuisines and these traditional cuisines. Coming into the living foods and vegan side, I was like, how can I innovate a lot of the culinary artistry I learned traditionally with different sources of food, with different materials? And I've always personally been lactose intolerant. So that was one of the bigger revelations for me with being vegan, was that the pasteurized mucus membrane of an animal is very undigestible for us, primarily because we don't have what's called lactase, which is the enzyme that breaks down lactose. And so the fat globules are much larger than human fat globules. That's why people will do better with goat milks than they do with cow milk, because the fat globules for a goat are almost the exact size as human fat globules. So that's why it's a very good alternative. If a mother isn't lactating properly for her baby, you use that alternative of the goat milk, and they do fine with it, because also remember, babies are producing lactase, so that enzyme breaks it down, and they do really well with it. And so obviously um raw anything, when you pasteurize milk, you kill it. So there is a phrase that you hear me say a lot: you eat life, you add to the life of your body; you eat death, you add to the
Right.
death of the cells. And the thing is that, anything, vegetables, anything at all, vegetables, meat, dairy, when you cook it, you kill it.
Yeah.
You kill all the enzymes in it. And there are tons of enzymes in dairy, in meats. um they're enzymatically rich still until you cook something, and then it kills it. In fact, there's a
Interesting.
lot of science. Yeah, there's a lot of science and research that humanity's gut, we used to have what is our appendix, which we look at as something that's expendable, used to actually be something else. It actually was a sausage shaped um, uh, second component to your stomach that produced heightened adaptogenic probiotics. So if we ate something poisonous, it had these adaptogenic um, probiotics, literally cultures that would repair the epigenome of our DNA if it got damaged from things. And so there's a scientist that has tracked that we took a fall in in our evolution when man went from eating raw materials, including raw meats that would be hunted, and we got the technology of fire, and we started cooking things over an open flame, and that started to put more carcinogens into the body, and we actually destroyed our stomachs and this organ over time, to where we've degenerated to now. And that there are
Yeah.
still humans out there that happen to have these specific cultures still, like for whatever reason, their genetic ancestry, they still have some of these prehistoric bacterias that most of us have had intergenerationally killed out of ourselves, our microbiome. But that
Wow.
really the fall of our digestion came from cooking things over fire, because before that we were eating everything raw and
Yeah.
everything alive. So, as I went into the living foods journey, I went into the living foods community, I started to look at the techniques and the formulas that they were coming up with to make raw foods, and then fused it with the the culinary artistry of gourmet cuisine I was originally trained in, and that's where I saw a real place for myself in innovating living foods to be better than what I was witnessing, which was very dense and moist things. People saying that, they're making a pie or a cake and it's just dates and nuts and
Right.
super dense. And if you like and you're getting into healthy foods, you're like, oh, this is cool. You kind of get used to these kinds of things. But I wanted to create something that invited people that would never normally eat some of the stuff that I started liking, into this format of eating life, and getting away from a lot of the sadly traditional forms of what we call food today, whether it be overprocessed baked goods, which are all fast burning carbohydrates. They're not slow burning carbs. So you have all these gluten rich baked goods,
Right.
and the rices and the pastas, as well as the processed oils and the processed dairy components. So I started looking, naturally being lactose intolerant, to other alternatives, and I noticed how much dairy was a compromise for me. So my focus was also, how can I recreate things that I would love to eat, like ice cream or cheesecake, but
Right.
can't eat because I can't digest it. And that's where a real drive, just for my own personal life enjoyment of foods, came in, where I was like, I don't accept that I can't eat some of these things that I've had in the past and are yummy, but really tax my system. So how can I create ice cream? How can I create cheesecake? How can I create butter frostings? Like, how can I do this? And so that's where I kind of got driven into it. And then, of course, um, I bought a lot of Living Foods cookbooks, and they were all very disappointing. A
Yeah,
lot of
they're all the
times,
same recipes recycled over and over.
well, and a lot of times I believe personally, they altered their measurements to not turn out like the food that they would make in their restaurants, so that you would have to go to their restaurants to
Oh,
get their food the same. They actually, because I would, as a chef, I would follow the recipe and it wouldn't turn out at all like the food I'd had from them. So then I would alter the recipe myself, just adaptogenically experimenting, and I would find, wow, I created the same thing that they made with a raw bread or whatever, but I had to change their measurements by a quarter cup, a third of a cup here and there. I'm like, there's no way that they were that off in their measurements. Like, it felt purposeful. So then that was really disappointing, because it's already a challenging thing to make food and then try something new and buy all the ingredients and go through it. And then it turns out off. It turns out wrong. It's very disheartening, and it doesn't motivate you to try and make new things. So that's kind of, to me, a form of a very evil thing to do, in the name of wanting to herd people into just getting the food you're making in your restaurant, but still selling them a book that says this will make the same thing. So through that, there wasn't enough pictures, there wasn't enough instruction. So from that, I feel like I got inspired to write a book that would be everything that all of those books weren't for me. And that's where I started the journey of writing this book, and writing a lot of the recipes I was formulating that were evolved from some of the recipes and formulas that I saw that to me weren't as good. And that's where I started collecting these recipes and starting to write a book, and also identifying a lot of the things that I feel like the books didn't identify, which is the spectrum of proteins and how proteins work, the truth about dairy, the concept of dairy being a concept, milk is a concept, cheese is a concept. You can make it from all kinds of things. And then that kind of began the journey. And at the time, I had an in-store line of Living Foods here on Kauai, and my food was selling out within 45 minutes of dropping it off. And I just didn't have the infrastructure to keep it going. And I was having a hard time writing the book and doing the in-store line of food. So I stopped the line of food to finish the book. And I ambitiously wrote this book and was so excited it was going to come out to the world. And then I hit some very steep walls of publishing realities at the time, which included nobody's interested in Living Foods. There's not as much of an audience for it at the time.
yeah.
Um, all of these things that were very disheartening, because I really thought, oh, this book's going to just change the world. This is, so exciting. This is going to launch me out. And I want to have a show on the Food Network called The Living Chef, because there's no representation for Living Foods on any of the food networks whatsoever. There still isn't to this day.
Is that
So
because so many of the Living Foods recipes take so much darn time? And we've had this conversation in private. Not to throw not throw you softball here, but isn't that the biggest misconception, is that I can't go more raw or more vegan because because every recipe is going to require me to spend 3 days preparing it. And I think we've had a
I
conversation
mean,
about this.
yeah, there's definitely a misconception about that, and that's why in the book we actually put a full calendar and schedule in it. And you know, that's the thing, like you can make a half gallon of oat milk in 15 minutes, you know, for yourself. Mac nut milk, you can about the same, about 20 minutes. You soak it for 5-10 minutes and then blend it, press it through a cheesecloth. You have a whole half gallon of macadamia nut milk. Almonds you have to soak for 6 to 8 hours. But even then, you put them in water, you go to sleep, you wake up in the morning, 10 minutes, you have a half gallon of almond milk.
Yeah,
So
that's not our
you
at
take
all.
then you take the nut pulp from that milk and you mix it with some honey or maple syrup and a little sea salt, some cinnamon, and then you stir it all around with a little psyllium husk. And you can make a whole tray of cookies that you throw into the dehydrator. You go to work, they dehydrate all day. You have a whole batch of cookies when you get home from work, that you did in a matter of, you know, 12 hours or whatever. And
Yeah,
some of these steps are, they're simple steps. So you just have to, you make your little cookies on the tray and you throw them in the dehydrator. You forget about it for 8 hours, 10 hours. So you go do whatever you need to do.
yeah.
You come back and they're done. So it's like, no, even though the windows for dehydration are elongated, the steps in between those windows are fairly
So
simple.
simple.
So
Is that because
you kind of
no, no, keep going.
you kind of just throw it in and go about your day, and then you just check it later, which you're normally doing with any foods anyways, because last time I checked, you come home and you want to eat something, and it's just nice because all of a sudden, oh, I have a tray of coconut bacon in my dehydrator. So you pull the tray out, you put it in a Tupperware, you have that for the next week to 2 weeks, depending on how much you eat, how much coconut bacon you eat. And so there's a way to time it where you're prepping food and then you're timing that prep food to be done. And then that food lasts you for a week and a half. And then before you're out of that food, you just start the steps to prep it again. So that by the time you're finishing out your last cookie, you have another tray that's already done that you can just replenish. And that gives you not only like sovereignty, but the independence of making your own food. When there was a whole thing where like, kombuchas were removed from the stores because of the alcohol content. There was like a whole thing. Like I wasn't short on kombucha. Like I had tons of bottles of kombucha. I was actually selling kombucha to people when they had pulled all the lines of GT's kombucha from the stores. I was supplying kombucha to people because so there's a sovereignty to it, you know, like making your own bread. It's like if there was no bread in the store anymore, you are making your own. You are the source of your own food production. And it's very empowering. And it also has your frequency and vibration in all the food that you make. And when you get into a tempo with it, like I said, you know, making your own tostadas, you don't have to go buy tostadas at the store because you can make your own. Even if you're gonna not be completely raw, these tostadas are healthier for you if you're eating some, you know, still eating animal proteins, hopefully from a much more refined and pure source. Um, you know, you don't have to go buy tostadas at the store because you're making your own batches. And by the time you're down to 3 or 4, you just start the steps to soak your flax seeds, get your corn kernels, blend it up, spread them on a tray. They go into the dehydrator for 6 hours. And all you have to do is within 6 hours, you're usually going to be back in your kitchen for something. You flip them back into the dehydrator for another 4 or 5 hours and they're done. They go into a Tupperware container. They're stocked for you and ready for the next week to 2 weeks, however you eat them. And so you kind of keep track as you're eating them. Okay, I only have 5 left. You might start another batch
Right.
and then they're done as you're finishing the last batch. And you naturally get into a tempo with this. And that just takes practice. And this is how we upgrade our lifestyle is we start incorporating healthy practices. We do it in lots of things from working out to you name it. And anything we practice, whether it's stretching or running or whatever, it requires some consistency and some discipline. So it doesn't seem that much of a stretch to incorporate that, especially when it's around food. And if you're a parent making food for your kids, giving them healthy alternatives for cookies and sweets and stuff, like our brownie that we make is literally you take dates, you take almonds or walnuts, You pulverize the walnuts in the blender, you throw the dates in, not the blender, the food processor. It processes it with a little maple syrup or honey and cacao. It processes it into this big chocolate gooey ball, and you spread that in a baking sheet, and then cut your brownie lines in it and throw it in the fridge. And it's literally a dense, rich brown. You just made that in 20 minutes. You don't have
Yes,
to bake
a
it,
lot
do
more
anything.
time.
You got a sheet of brownies that took you 20 minutes to make. There
Yeah.
was no prep on it. You didn't have to soak anything. So there are a lot raw dishes that don't require soaking. Um, and then the ones that do, like I said, you just factor that into your schedule. And also because you like making these vegan raw burgers. Like a lot of times
Right,
you
right,
could just take with you in a bag. You don't even have to make a whole sandwich with it. You just have it as a patty of protein to munch on. And so
right.
a lot of that came from seeing more militant vegan raw foodists, like a brother of mine who was just on top of every cycle of nuts or thing. He'd just make bags of herb nuts or cheesy herb nuts, almonds, let's say. And he just always had bags of them. And so whenever we'd go places, he always had his own little bag of food that he just kind of kept with him. And I would come over to his house and he'd be pulling the next tray out as he was finishing off the last one. He was in a schedule of it. And I saw, wow, if you're going to do this, this is the way that you do it functionally, you know?
That's right.
Um, so, and that just comes with, you really want to be vegan. You really want to be raw foodist. That's not eating Impossible burgers and being codependent on someone else making you food. If you really want to do this, you need to involve and engage yourself in the practices of doing this and really living that lifestyle. To me, in my experience, as someone who's been vegan for who was vegan for almost 10 years. So
Yeah.
it's not a fad. It's not something, although many people I notice like to psychologically egoically say I'm this now and feel better about themselves. It's like, to really be that is not to support companies that are actually killing more animals per square yard growing your GMO soybeans or whatever, pea proteins, and thinking that you're solid, you're protecting animals when really you're contributing to more animal death per acre. They're just birds and rodents and squirrels and smaller forest animals that are being killed, murdered for commercial farming that's supporting your vegan burger through a corporation than cows themselves for people that are eating cows. Like you, so it's there's I see a lot of hypocrisy with this. So it's a trip to see how this vegan movement has sprung for someone who's been in this for 20 years and familiarized and gone through a lot of the mental side, the egoic side. I'm not going to say I definitely had more adolescent stages being vegan. I was a super self-righteous vegan that would condemn every person I came across that would eat meat. And I went through many stages of that was very alienating for people that I cared about, that I thought I was self-righteously helping, when, really helping people is not alienating or judging them, which you're not supposed to be doing anyways. Judge not unless you want to be judged yourself, but actually like more, a higher level of tolerance, and then educating people in a
Yeah.
way on the true nature of food and biochemistry and how things work and how your microbiome works and what happens when you eat overcooked foods in general or processed dairy and how it leaches calcium from your bones rather than gives you any calcium. And it makes you more acidic and it's undigestible. And so that then came about for some of the foods in the vegan food industry, like cashews. And that's where we launched the cashew conspiracy side of it. Was that this was a
So,
nut
yeah,
that I,
because when you mentioned that, I was just downright shocked. I mean, one of my favorite vegan recipes was to do the garlic, onions, cashews, and maybe almond milk, and do like an Alfredo with that and a bunch of, nutritional yeast, of course. But
yep.
I spent about 7 years vegan and 19 years vegetarian, and cashews have been a foundational part of my diet until I read your book. So can you tell the audience how we've been misled into thinking cashews were this extremely healthy, great, great tool for the vegan diet, and what you've learned.
Yeah, I mean, I myself was the same, and this became our kind of, like it's kind of like soy. Like soy became this, oh, soy's so great, and then we found out soy's really not good for you. Actually, it
Right.
boosts the estrogen levels in the body, and in fact, the actual culture soy comes from, it's less than like 3% of their diet in their own indigenous, in their own culture of their society. Like their food culture around soy is so minuscule. And so then of course we blow it up in the West. We get all these companies that invest in soy, right? So now they're financially invested because there's a demand for it. And then
Right.
everyone finds out it's extremely toxic and not good for you. And then the companies are like, well, we already built the infrastructure to make a bunch of soy products and soy milks and soy ice cream. So they just keep on doing it,
Right.
um, and I noticed that actually for all vegetarian milks, except for there's one form of rice dream, has something called vitamin A palmitate in it. Just so you guys know, vitamin A palmitate. It is a literal coagulant artificial component that's put in all vegetarian milks. That's why you should always make your own milks. And so I found out vitamin A palmitate actually is extremely undigestible. So it's kind of just the lesser evil of drinking cow's milk, because all these vegetarian milks, go look, they have it in there. It's a form of a vitamin A. They'll say some form of, and they've actually started changing it because people start finding out about vitamin A palmitate. But there is a binding agent coagulant that they put into these milks, and none of them are good for you. None of them are digestible. They're not. And that's so hard for so many, because people have then changed from dairy. They like their coconut milk, they like their rice milk, they like their soy milk. And it's like, but when you find out it's not good for you, what wasn't that the reason that you stopped drinking pasteurized dairy?
That's exactly
So
right. My son's never had
aren't
cow's
you,
milk.
yeah, aren't you like literally contradicting yourself for the very reason you shifted to
Mhm.
this other thing that you're now continuing to drink because you found out it's not good for you? So cashews were very much the same. It became this staple in the raw food industry. Oh, we can make cheesecakes, we can make cream sauces. Look at how awesome it is. We can do all these things being vegan that like dairy can do. And this became our kind of showboaty staple of,
Yeah.
and I have a cream cheese that recipe I made with cashews that's amazing. It tastes so much like real cream cheese. It was one of my proudest recipes. So even for myself, I had to take a hard, humble check of myself when I found out that there's a neurotoxin in cashews that acts kind of like poison oak, that is extremely toxic. In fact, actually I found out that raw cashews, if you eat them, you can die from them. They have such a concentrate of this neurotoxin in them, and so they pasteurize all cashews, including the ones that they say are raw in the stores. They are not. They are pasteurized, because if you ate real raw cashews that were sun dried, you would die or
Mm.
get extremely sick. And so actually, and there's a whole thing with cashews being mass produced in other countries that is extremely inhumane, where the workers, their fingers get blackened from handling the cashews, from the level of toxins that these workers, migrant workers, these impoverished workers that are trying to have a job, work in these cashew industry. There's a whole thing about them. They're just, their health is extremely taxed because they're handling these toxins from these cashews as they're being processed. So sadly, what's considered a raw cashew that's pasteurized has more of the neurotoxin in it. Actually, roasted cashews, or when they actually roast them more, they're able to get more of this neurotoxin out. But still, you're getting maybe 60-70% of the toxin out of the nut, which means there's still an aspect of it that's still in the cashew. And that's why I noticed I'd eat these creamy sauces or this cheesecake for this cashew, and then I'd be farting it up 15 minutes later, or having some indigestion, and I'd be like, I don't get it. Well, that did not sit well. What was that? Well, that's the aspect of the cashew. The cashew is undigestible. And that's what I was experiencing, the indigestibility of this nut. So then I
So
was like,
this
wow,
immediate effects. This is not like, oh, maybe you're going to be at higher risk
no,
of
it would
dementia or
just be,
Alzheimer's. Like you had immediate, instant indigestion. This felt bad. Your body was saying, no, stop. You're
it would be just like me having some dairy. I would be feeling the same kind of a,
Wow.
like, and so basically I instantly had to go, I took a hard look at, whoa, here is what a conspiracy. The cashew industry and the raw food industry like are in cahoots in a sense. Like
Yeah.
this is not a raw nut. We're speaking as if it's a raw nut. It's not a raw nut.
Right.
Um, and and so I went to a lot of the chefs and a lot of the restaurants. I was like, yo, you know, guys understand this. They didn't care. They have their recipes formulated. People like them. They didn't care. They were like, what, lesser of two evils. And they had no moral ethical conflict with calling this still raw, even though it wasn't. So
Wow, that's really hard.
I was not good with that. And so I instantly started rewriting all my recipes. I started writing all my recipes again to include, I was like, okay, I have to find something else we can cream. And of course, being on the island and with the resources we are, I dove deep into coconut and found this
Really cool.
bioavailable thing that would cream, that tastes very androgynous. And we have a lot of coconut species here that don't taste coconutty. And the younger the meats you get, the less they have a coconut flavor to them. So I found a new cream that I had to rewrite all my recipes, which is why I'm glad we didn't publish this book years ago, because I needed to change it up. So this is the first living foods book that I know of that doesn't really use cashews in it for creams. Now, obviously it's harder for people to get some coconuts if you're living in New Jersey or places like that. And so we
Or
have kind of a
Aspen,
second.
Colorado.
Yeah, exactly. But you can find coconuts still where you are. And you also you can, like, you can still find some coconuts. You can find like it, and this is also where I was like, okay, well, we have a very untapped resource that goes to waste on this island. Like 100,000 coconuts go to waste every month here on this island. So there's no coconut processing facility for our specific island. So I started to build the infrastructure for what we call the Cloud Coconut Creamery, to build a company where we could build a national brand of prepared creams, coconut creams, that people could be using for their living foods recipes. So, and they would be, you know, as unprocessed as possible, as a cream base that could go out as a national brand where people, you don't even have to process the coconut yourself. You have this cream to incorporate into the various recipes as an alternative
Yeah.
to cashews. And so just like cashews weren't super popular in terms of live raw cashews until the living foods industry really fueled that. And now that's the thing. You have all this investment now in cashews, cashew companies, because of the demand for it. Now, like I said, like the soy, we're finding out it's not good for you. So guess what? So we have to change our format. We need to start investing in companies that can produce another alternative for creams. And that's where, for me, the Cloud Creamery is going to be that. And that's where we're building an infrastructure for something just like they did for the cashews, to adapt to more of the information that came in. Because once you find out the truth, do you just deny it and disregard it, or do you do something about staying in that truth wherever it goes and adapting to live in that truth? And so, as much as you might like cashews, just accept that the truth is they're not a raw nut. So just don't call yourself a raw foodist or a living foods person, which, by the way, is an egoic identification anyways. Eat what your body responds to in the biochemistry of your individual blood and your chemistry. Everyone is different. Everyone has a different blood chemistry. Everyone just has a different biochemistry. What works for me might not work for you. And this is the other thing I saw with the diet psychosis. We're pushing a lot of very like totalitarian ideologies around diet. Oh, how about the kale? Everyone should eat kale. Oh, kale, kale, kale. Well, we found out that there's a neurotoxin. There's a form of because that's the thing with plants, is they can't run away from you like animals can. So they produce neurotoxins to defend themselves so that
Yeah, right.
animals don't eat all of them. So there is actually a chemical compound in kale that makes it very undigestible.
It's
So
spinach
you have
too.
to
There's
break
something
it.
in spinach.
In most leafy greens, there's these things. So you have to prepare them. You have to break them down and condition them, so to speak. So that's something that is necessary that most people didn't know. But of course, they were pushing, everyone should eat this. Everyone should. Bottom line is, it takes a lot more effort to experiment individually, on what works and doesn't work for your body, for your biochemistry. It takes a lot more effort and love and care to do that than to just listen to someone else telling you what you should eat.
Yeah.
And that's where I noticed a lot. People just want to be told, oh, I'll eat this. I'll eat this. It's like experimentation is the way to find out what truly works for you. And you know what? It takes more effort. So you should be willing to put that effort in for your body and your health and wellness to see what works for me, what doesn't work for me. Some things might work for you that don't work for me. I'm not just going to blindly start following that diet aimlessly in that regard.